Hello and welcome to this video where I want to take you through the various business stages and the different types of considerations that you need to take at the various business stages, which I've titled From Survival to Freedom. Over the last 30 years or so for my working life, most of which has been involved in and around my own businesses or more recently working with others on their businesses, what I've been able to observe and categorise, I suppose, is the various stages it is that we go through when we engage or become involved in our own business. And I think it's worthwhile just having a look at those various stages and particularly looking at the types of things that it can teach us or make us aware of as we sort of move through the various stages, and perhaps more importantly, the sort of decision making processes perhaps that we want to look at as we do that. So when I talk about from survival to freedom, essentially what I'm talking about is that in what I've been able to categorize is about five, not distinct, these are not mutually exclusive stages. They do sort of interact, and indeed we can go back and forth a little bit. But essentially, it's about five stages that I've been able to sort of categorize that we walk through as we embark on this journey of business for ourselves. The first stage is what I've labelled startup. So, and I guess the best example I can think of there is my own. When early in my career, I had about 10 or 11 years of corporate life where I was essentially working in what I learned to be quite a sheltered and comfortable environment that I was working in. But when I left that business or that corporate life to embark on my own business, essentially I was in this stage of startup. And I have to say, at the time, I reflect on it and think back, it was actually a feeling of some excitement for me. It was something new. All of a sudden, I felt like for the first time in a long time, I was actually in control. Whereas working in a corporate life, obviously working for others and hierarchy, there was always other bosses that you were answerable to. All of a sudden, I actually was quite attracted towards this idea of being my own boss and feeling like I had control. In hindsight, somewhat naively, but however, certainly remember feeling at the time it was a very exciting sort of time for me. But it didn't take me long to realise that in this phase two, it actually is a time when you need to invest. So this is the point of time when you're looking to establish the business itself. So the considerations at this point are really around about setting up the business foundations. So in my own case, for example, I just needed simple things like a vehicle. We needed premises, obviously, to actually operate from, and really establishing, investing in those sort of things sucked up a lot of those early dollars for me when I was actually doing that. I remember thinking that obviously with this investment we need to start to think about some level of return at some point soon, but in the actual business development parts of it weren't at this stage the initial considerations when I was really at this point in time. The second stage really is only achieved if you are successful in breaking through, and I've put a red line through that on purpose. It's actually what I call a brick wall, where unfortunately the statistics would suggest that not a lot of businesses actually get past that stage, and it can vary in time. And I think more recently with higher levels of technology, I'm seeing a lot of these time spans come down. Traditionally this used to be about a 3 to 5 year sort of period where if you got through that 3 to 5 years, it used to was a bit of a benchmark that you considered, well, if I got through this period of time, I'm actually on the way up. But I'm seeing these things the time frames seem to be shortening down with the advent of more technology and the different types of businesses that we find ourselves actually working in these days. However, if you are successful in breaking through that brick wall and you've got yourself established, you move through into what I'm calling this growth, or it's probably more accurately early growth. And what it's really recognising is that at this point we are actually serving customers. So we've got our products and services actually operating at this point in time. My recollection of this time was that, whilst you think that it would be a period of comfort, it actually wasn't, because I'd been trading for a period of time at this stage, and I was still really in a position where, remembering that the cash flow, whilst it was coming in, I had customers. It was really not all that substantial. So the focus at this stage and early growth stage was very much for mine around and business development, attracting more customers, and I started to also consider making sure that there was actually profit in doing that as well. So in our startup phase, we tend to come into the market, enter into the market quite competitively. Once we move through into this phase, we start to turn our focus towards building more profitable clients in our business. So it was, as I recollect, a period of time when it certainly wasn't comfort. There was a certain level of unease as I was moving through this phase. But the good news was that we did have cash flow, we did have customers, and essentially at this point in time, the focus really needed to be on doing more of the same. So it was attracting profitable clients and making sure we did what we did very well. And certainly that's the focus when you're in this growth phase. The next stage is what I consider to be the transitional phase, and it's to some extent also the most dangerous stage because at this point in time we actually start to feel a little bit more relaxed because we've built on our growth, our early growth phases. We've got more customers, more patients in our business, and effectively what we are is a business that's starting to grow successfully, and at this point in time even starting to generate some real profit. It might even be the first time in our own business or practice that we've actually started to take what we'd consider to be a reasonable wage, a reasonable takeout of money from our business. So I've called this one payback, a little bit on purpose, because it's the first time that we get to a point where you can start to feel like you're just a little bit more relaxed. The danger here I see is that at this phase, what we've really got is a situation where we can easily take our eye off the ball. At this point in time, we've grown to a point where we've probably got some fairly happy patients or customers, and they're coming back frequently. We're probably at this point also starting to employ a few more people in our business. But the only measures, and this is what I need to stress at this point, the measures that we use need to be a good combination of what I call leading and lag indicators. The most common lag indicator that we do use is actually dollars. We tend to look at our profit and loss. Those of you a little bit more financial savvy might look at your balance sheets and maybe even generate some cash flow reports. But the profit and losses, unfortunately, financial reports are really only a measure of things that have already happened. And unfortunately, they do mask a lot of other things. If we're making profit, for example, it might be that we sort of sit back and think, well, that's a really good result. However, if you think of the iceberg, where a third of the iceberg actually sits above the water and 2/3 below the water, in payback period we're tending to focus on that 1/3 above the water, where things are essentially quite visible and ostensibly running along rather smoothly. However, underneath that, the other 2/3 that's sitting below the surface could be actually hiding some pretty substantial things that we need to not be blind to when we're in this phase. So payback for mine is a period of time or a phase where, for the astute business people, they would be starting to look at some of the things that I'm going to introduce in this next stage at this point. Unfortunately, that tends not to be the reality, and most people sort of go through their payback period, and the only time that they start to stand back and look at their business is at this plateau stage, where what we see is the number of patients or customers starts to plateau out, or maybe the profitability starts to plateau out. And the way I see this, when I've sort of talked to a lot of people in small business, the thing that it seems to show up as for mine, when I talk to the owners, and I remember feeling this for myself as well, it's this feeling of frustration and even disillusionment about, I seem to be working harder now, or as hard as I ever have. The business seems to be dragging me more and more back into it. My staff, because at this point in time you would typically have staff working with you, my staff don't seem to be stepping up, or they don't seem to be taking the level of responsibility that I would expect of them. So we're pushing systems, like it's another big area that I come up against, where we're pushing a larger amounts of business through probably systems that we established even maybe way back at startup. So we're pushing all of these new business and larger amounts of business through old systems, and they're just not robust enough typically to enable that sort of level of business to run through smoothly. So again, the sort of symptoms that crop up are, we might be getting the odd level of patient or customer complaint. It might be that we're starting to see some of our staff turnover, where people are leaving us, or perhaps there's a little bit of mood, or not a feeling of happiness around the workplace. So this is the sort of ways or things that I find symptomatic of when we're starting to enter into this phase. And of course, again, if we're using lagging indicators like our financials to measure, all these things that I just discussed are going to be quite heavily masked. They're not necessarily going to be identifiable. They might be anecdotal because it's visual, like you can actually see the mood and the turnover. But if we're not measuring these sort of things, then it could be that we're getting onto these things quite a deal too late. So, but again, Plato stage is a very clear indicator to me that some of these things are coming under pressure. And if we're not careful and address them, it could be a situation where the plateau could, and I have seen, move into a decline, and rather than grow, that tips over the edge and actually starts to go and decline without some specific action taken by and responsibility taken by the owners of the actual business itself. So it tends to show up as this next brick wall. So I've identified the first brick wall between startup and that early growth phase. This is another brick wall that we actually hit, and it can be another quite serious brick wall if it's not really addressed and taken on responsibility with some specific actions taken. And I suppose the sort of things that it sort of shows up for me, the cycle that people find themselves in when it's happening like this is, we feel like we're in a situation where we're just an observer of things that are going on around us, and it's this feeling of loss of control. I said right at the outset that one of the things that attracted me into small business, and I'm sure it does for a lot of you watching who are in a small business, is the sense or feeling that you can take control over things, control over decisions, control over your own life, control over things that happen in around the business. So, but of course, that's a little bit naive. Once we get to these stages, and particularly the second brick wall that I'm describing now, it's quite a feeling of, you just not actually got much control at all. You're just really sitting there and observing, and largely having to react to the things that are going on around you. So, it could be, if we've got new sort of practices or competitors opening up nearby, that we start to fear starts to come up within us as to how we need to react to some of those things. If we're finding that it's hard to attract staff or even retain staff, they're moving on, we're having to react to their situations. Again, it's this loss of control feeling that we tend to come up with. And once we sort of move through that, we then feel in this situation where we just have to adapt to the times. And to some extent, we normalise this. We, as we sort of move around this cycle, this circle that exists, it somewhat becomes a bit of a norm. And if we're not careful, we get too sucked up in it. It's very hard to break out of this actual cycle itself. And I've seen many instances of people that I've worked with through the years where they're really caught up in this cycle, and it just goes round and round, and it's very hard to see outside of that there is any hope. And largely, if I was to label it in a word, it's really about survival. Businesses that are like this are very much in this state of survival, and it's not a situation that's very comfortable, and you find people at this point in time are quite stressed, and it's not a situation that is conducive to really success moving forward. In fact, if anything, these are the times when you start to see people fall into states of depression and not really knowing what to do next. So the proposition that I suggest is that we need to somehow actually break out of the cycle. We need to start to step back and take some level of responsibility for what it is that we've created, because largely, if you really dumb it down into its specifics, we've actually created this situation for ourselves. As owners, we need to actually take responsibility for that and step back out of the mire and start to say, well, okay, what is it that we need to do to actually break ourselves out of the cycle? So it's drawing this line in the sand. So one of the things that I like to focus on, if you're in this second brick wall sort of stage here, the type of things that are coming up are, things like systems. It's things like having the right people on the bus and having them, when they're in there on the bus, having them in the actual right seats themselves. So there's things like roles, responsibilities need to be clearly identified. One of the big things for mine in this area is what I call letting go, particularly of the owners. It's a difficult thing for the owners to really pass over this situation to others in their business, particularly if history says that these haven't been very good experiences. So history would, the fear there would be that history repeats itself, so we struggle to actually let go and pass over responsibilities. Success with that, though, would allow us to free up to a large extent and move from being an observer to actually physically going out and discovering what's out there. So what are potentially some of the new opportunities that exist? Are there actual gaps in what it is that we're currently providing? Are there new technologies that we could be adapting in our practice, for example, that might give us a more comprehensive service to our patients and our clients? Are there different types of treatments, for example, if we're in practice, the different treatments that we could be learning to essentially extend our service levels to our patients and our clients? So freeing ourselves up to enable us to go outside of our current existence to look at some of the possibilities out there is the first step, really, of three in doing this. Once we've actually discovered that, it's important, though, that we take that and what I call create, and move from reaction into a world of creation where we can actually take what we've discovered and build some action around that starts to implement that into our practice or our business. So essentially what we're looking for is taking ideas, putting some action around those and learning from those actions what comes up. And then, if you like, think of it as a cycle of action, evaluation, reevaluation, and then more action. But essentially putting ourselves into a world of creation. And of course, what we're doing by doing all of that is we become innovators. We start to innovate in what could consider to be difficult markets. And I've seen many examples of people who you'd consider to be potentially in a very, very competitive and crowded market to all of a sudden step outside of all of that and become considered innovators in the market and start to get what I would consider to be a reasonable service or reasonable return on their investment. So these are the ways that we can actually physically break through this brick wall, this plateau brick wall. And I've labelled it here advanced growth for the want of the word, but it's essentially taking us beyond this plateau and taking us into a point where the business all of a sudden can generate some more dollars for itself. This is a business that doesn't necessarily rely so heavily on us. It's a business that we've started to put some smart strategies into place where we can largely generate its own income. And innovation is all about trying to create a business that doesn't rely on us. And I'm reminded of the case study when I started work with Troy Parsons at the podiatrist some 5 years or so ago. And what I recall then was him tied up in a situation where he was generating better than half of the revenue for the business, for his practice. And he was one of about, I think, 4 or 5 at the time, podiatrists, professional podiatrists working in his practice. And what he was largely, the proposition that I was putting to him of him needing to step back from his business more and spend more time working on his business, immediately raised these red flags of fear from Troy. I recall it vividly, where he said, well, just look at the numbers. If I do that and I step back from that, my business is just going to go south because it's so reliant on me to generate the revenue. And, on numbers, you couldn't argue with that sort of logic. But the point that I found when we started to move into a bit more of a discovery phase, when we started to take our observe hat off and start to look for opportunities, one of the things that was very obvious when we started to do that was that Troy's billings were considerably higher, and in one or two instances even double what some of his other podiatrists were doing. And the question that immediately came to my mind when we were looking at that was, well, why is this so? What is it about your style of practice versus your other podiatrist style of practice that's creating a situation where you're outbilling to such levels? And at that point in time, I remember Troy is so busy that he couldn't even answer that question because he didn't know. He didn't know what the patient experience was or what the other practices of his podiatrist were. He had no idea at that point in time just what the consult process was going like. So he was out of touch, largely out of touch with what was going on. And it didn't take very long for us to point out, and for Troy, the obvious question in that situation was, well, if you could possibly get your other podiatrist to even bill at, 3/4 or 80% of what you're billing, what would that actually mean for your practice? And it didn't take very long for Troy's eyes to light up and see that the impact on the business would have been substantial. And he was effectively the one getting in the way of actually progressing his own practice. So from that perspective, it really hit home very strongly to Troy the need for him to step back and invest a bit of time in his people and look at exactly what it was that was going on with his team. Of course, what that does mean is a little bit of a setback. So there is a bit of a J-curve effect, and that's something that you realise. But it's an investment, and that's the way I tried to get Troy to understand it, and he grabbed it with both hands. That effectively what he was doing is no different to making an investment in marketing. This is an investment in his time, in his people, to try and upskill and upgrade them to get them sort of billing at a more professional rate. And of course, this is not about over-servicing. What the findings were that there was a lot of inconsistencies in his practice about the practices, what was going on. The consult had no uniformity whatsoever. A lot of the guys were lacking in confidence, and they weren't really sure about the approach that they should be taking. There is a big fear in professional people about over-servicing, and the big issue with that is that by not approaching this, in essence, largely, we could well be risking under-servicing. And basically, there were diagnoses that potentially were getting missed because the guys weren't taking a sort of a structured and consistent approach to the way that they were treating their patients. So through the process of Troy just stepping back 1 or 2 days initially, spending a bit more time in his path, he didn't go cold turkey. He just stepped back a little bit and started to spend a bit more time with his people. And what he discovered was very quickly these guys were starting to step up and take responsibility. So from that perspective, the impact was significant. And the benefits are manifold. It's not just a simple question of dollars here. The big benefits, actually, if we really are truthful about this, was that the patient experience was much more thorough. The patients actually are very, very happy with their podiatrists because they're getting such a thorough diagnosis now. And there's been some quite technical and sophisticated problems that the guys have been able to treat and deal with through the process that they're now adopting. The other benefit that comes to mind is that the podiatrists themselves, their confidence is growing and growing considerably. They're much more satisfied in their work. They feel a lot more like they are helping their patients because they're actually dealing into a lot of new types of areas. And from that perspective, they're giving their clients their patients a much more thorough and advanced diagnosis and kicking quite a number of goals as well. from that point of view. And I suppose largely that shows up in Troy's practice as low turnover. Troy hasn't lost a podiatrist for other than maternity leave that I can recall. And it was a big issue in the early days, initially to attract podiatrists. He works in a regional centre, so being in a regional area, it was a bit more difficult to attract people. To the extent now where people are approaching him at early stage, like even in their final years at university. Troy is actually getting approaches from people who are wanting to come and work with him because the culture that he's created is starting to develop its own reputation. So people are actually sticking and enjoying their work so much more, and you certainly feel that when you walk into his practice. The other big benefit that happens for Troy personally is in his own development. He's been able to recently go away overseas and look at some new technologies, and so he's had the freedom to be able to go and do that. And he's brought a lot of that knowledge back with him now. He's completed a course away overseas, and he's brought a lot of that knowledge back. He's training his podiatrists up in that. So again, he's putting his practice at the cutting edge. And the other thing that's really nice for him, I feel, is that the actual freedom that this has created for him to enable more time with things like his family. These are the intangibles, but Troy used to stress a lot about the fact that he had no time, no personal time, no time to be able to spend with his family. Financially, he felt under the pump. He was under pressure financially, and now he's also extending his thought processes to spending time in things like the Podiatry Hive, where he's giving back a lot of the experience and knowledge that he's been able to create. He's now sharing that more widely across the podiatry community, which I think is a tremendous achievement for him to now be able to give back to his own profession like that. It's been such a wonderful journey for him to see him come from where he was to where he is now. So these are the stages, and this is essentially what I believe are good indicators for us to consider where we're at on these stages and the types of things we need to think at. At startup, it's really about getting your foundations down and starting to attract clients. So startup is all about focusing on those couple of areas. Growth is about starting to still attract more clients, but it's about money. Essentially, really trying to make sure we start to focus on things like profit and that we are attracting the right type of client. Payback is a time not necessarily to sit back and relax, which unfortunately is a bit of a tendency and a thing that happens to us. Payback for mine is that transitional period where we need to start to focus on our systems, on our people, make sure we've got our roles and responsibilities very clear. And from that perspective, it'll set up minimising, if any, plateau. It's potentially a situation where you can push through the plateau. And if the shorter we can push through that plateau, or shorten the time down to that plateau and move through that brick wall into advanced growth, the quicker it is that we'll start to feel the type of freedom that we all are really searching for in our lives. And it's largely breaking out of this cycle, moving into a cycle where we can have the time to go out and discover new opportunities and new joint ventures, new alliances, new opportunities overall. We move away from reaction into creation, where we're creating our own world for ourselves, and we become the innovators, the leaders in our own field. And overarching all of that, as I say, it's about freedom. I think that's something we all aspire to. It's achievable, and effectively moving through these stages and understanding them really well, intimately, will help us actually achieve that. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to sharing more information in future videos coming up. Thank you for watching.